Vigraham Trinayanam Manikya Mauli Spurat Taranayaka Shekharam Smitamukhi Mapina Vakshoruham Panibhyamali Purna Ratna Chashakam Raktotpalam Saumyam Ratna Ghatastha Rakta Charanam Dhayet Paramambikam
Namaste, Shri Gurubhyo Namaha, Harihi Om. A warm welcome to all our friends who have joined us this evening or this morning, this noon, from whichever place you are, for the 36th day of the Global Festival of Yoga. Indeed, we are highly blessed to have two Swamijis addressing us today. In the morning, we had Shri Chanchalapati Prabhuji from ISKCON Bangalore, who spoke about Annam Bahu Kurvita, the importance of serving food. And this evening we have with us Swami Brahmananda. Swami Brahmananda, pranams and swagatam. May I now request you to kindly come on the screen, please. Swami Brahmananda is joining us from Bahamas, from the Caribbean islands. Swamiji.
Namah Shivaya.
As I said, a pleasure.
I'd like
This is
to
the second session of the
thank the
36th day.
organizers of the event for inviting myself on behalf of the Sivananda Ashram Yoga Retreat in the Bahamas to present this teaching. We'd like to begin with a few moments of silent meditation and then a short chanting, and then we'll begin the talk. So we'll close our eyes for a few moments. Om, Om, Om. Gajananam Bhutaganadi Sevitam Kapita Jambupala Sara Bhakshitam Umasatam Shokavina Shakaranam Namami Vigneshwara Padapam Kajam Shadananam Kumkumaraktavaranam Mahamatim Divya Mayuravahanam Rudrasya Sunam Surasanyanatam Guham Sadaham Sharanam Prapadye Ya Kundendu Tushara Haradevala Ya Shubra Vastra Vrita Ya Vina Vradendamantita Kara Ya Sveta Padmasana Ya Brahma Chuta Shankara Prabhitibir Deva Isada Pujita Samampatu Saraswati Bhagavati Nishesha Jatyapaha Om Namah Shivaya Gurave Sachitananda Murtaye Nishprapanchaya Shantaya Shri Sivananda Te Namaha Shri Vishnu Devananda Te Namaha Om Sarvamangala Mangalye Shive Sarvata Sadike Charanye Triambake Gauri Narayani Namostute Narayani Namostute Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhanaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahe Tejasvinavaditamastu ma vidvishavai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om Peace Peace Peace. Om Bolo Sadguru Sivananda Maharaj Ki Jai. Swami Vishnu Devananda Maharaj Ki Jai. Om Namah Shivaya. I would like again to thank the organizers, Hari, Vinaya Chandra, and all the many others that I'm sure are behind organizing this wonderful event. I would like also to thank Swami Prakashananda that made the connection to facilitate this lecture. And today we will be giving a short teaching from the Bhagavad Gita, from chapter 17, from Swami Sivananda's commentary. And the topic is called, As a man's faith is, so is he. This is an analysis on the topic of faith and how faith determines our actions, aspirations, and everything that is the result of fruition, fulfillment of our life. So I would like to, first of all, refer to verse number 2 in chapter 17. The Blessed Lord said, "Threefold is the faith of the embodied, which is inherent in their nature. The Sattvic pure, the Rajasic or passionate, and the Tamasic. Do thou hear of it." Okay, so Lord Krishna explains to Arjuna about the nature of threefold faith. And by word faith, as we are going to see from the explanations, a very special meaning is given here. The faith that is spoken here by Lord Krishna is something very fundamental, what he also calls as nature, the nature of a person. It's not simply a faith in the sense of belief, but faith is something fundamental to the way we perceive the world and ourselves, and from which all our aspirations and motivations in the world and our goals emerge from. Swami Sivananda explains the whole world is made up of faith, as it were. So what does it mean? Faith here means the deep vasanas and samskaras, the deep-rooted tendencies, karmic tendencies that we have from many previous lives. These karmic tendencies that are the results of our previous actions are deeply embedded in our subconscious mind. And they color the way we perceive the world, the way we perceive ourselves and our relationship in the world. So when each one of us looks at the world, we look at it from this nature which is deeply embedded within us, what is called here faith. And if you look at the world and you contemplate, this world is such an interesting place. There are so many people doing so many things. And I'm sure many people wonder, looking at the world, looking at what people do in the world, for good and for bad. And many times we can sit and contemplate what makes this person do what they do, or what made this person dedicate their energy and time to what they dedicated their life to. What made this person accomplish what they accomplished? And the answer will be, it's their faith, which means the tendencies embedded in their minds that brought their aspirations and desires and motivated them to act, caused them to perceive the world in a certain way. So everything within this world, such as institutions, philosophies, sciences, technology, organizations, spiritual missions, are the results of the actions of people. So if you think about it, everything that you perceive in the world is a result of someone's actions, someone's dedication and energy. Why did they dedicate their time and life for what they did, right? For example, take Swami Sivananda Saraswati of Rishikesh, right? So he dedicated his life to the mission of spreading yoga and Vedanta all over the world and training so many disciples, right? So it came from his vision, from his understanding and realization of the world and his place within it. In the case of Swami Sivananda, the world is the self. So when we see institutions, financial systems, technologies, they are the results of the actions of people that emerge from their aspirations. Why these specific aspirations? Why did they dedicate themselves to this? Because of their faith. When they open their eyes and look at the world, their vision of the world is colored by this deep embedded nature in them, which here is called faith. So the fundamental way of how we perceive the world and our place within it, from which our aspirations arise, from which our desires, how we perceive that we are here to fulfill ourselves in the world, all arise from this fundamental thing, which in this chapter is called faith. And Swami Sivananda explains, he says that the antakarana, the mind, is Shraddha Maya. Shraddha Maya means full of faith, which means these tendencies, these impressions of past lives are pervading and permeating our minds. Our subconscious mind, our understanding, and therefore the vision of how we perceive the world is permeated by this faith. We may recognize it, we may not recognize it. But all our aspirations, our desires, our motivations, the things we want to dedicate ourselves to, arise from this fundamental faith. Okay, so this is what Swami Sivananda means when he says the whole world is made up, as it were, of faith. Everything you perceive in this world is the result of someone's actions, aspirations, the way they saw the world and the way they contributed to it and still do. So this world, therefore, is made up of the faith of the people that come and go through it. This is the meaning. So this is how Swami Sivananda begins. He says, this world is made up of the faith of the people that came through it and are still operating in it. Then, Lord Krishna explains that the faith is threefold. It is made of sattva, rajas, and tamas, according to the predominance of the mind. As we know, the three gunas manifest in the whole of creation and also in the mind being part of creation. So the tendencies of the mind, the vasanas and the samskaras, are colored by the gunas. So each one of us has sattvic impressions and tendencies, Rajasic ones and Tamasic ones in different predominance. And this determines the way we perceive the world, this faith that Lord Krishna mentions here. The mind being Shraddha Mayad, filled with faith, is determined by the nature of the quality or the qualities that color our mind. Based on this, we are going to engage with the world. So this is explained further. Swami Sivananda explains, when sattva or purity is strongly developed, when there is a preponderance of sattva in a man, it is easy for him to attain self-realization or the knowledge of the self. So what does it mean? When a person has preponderance of sattva in the mind, so that fundamental faith that we mentioned is predominantly of pure tendencies, pure impressions. It will be easy for that person, Swami Sivananda says, to attain the knowledge of the self. Why is it easy? Very important to understand. Again, the fundamental way of how we perceive the world, which means the nature of these vasanas, samskaras, etc., generates our aspirations and desires. People that have dominance of sattva, see these sattvic or pure tendencies, they are constantly perceiving, you see, the nature of sattva is expansion, light, purity. When these people, when these minds encounter the limitations of the world, they encounter the confinements of worldly achievements, the impermanence of things being filled with pain. The worldly achievements are impermanent, temporary, always mixed with pain. When such minds encounter this, they deeply analyze it. That's the nature of sattva. Sattva is introspective. So the moment they encounter these limitations, the limitations of the world, they begin to think. This is the nature of their mind. Why? Just like a river is flowing, and when it encounters rocks, etc., it immediately changes routes and finds its way down the slope. In the same way, the mind's, the sattvic tendencies in the mind are constantly pushing the mind towards freedom, towards absence of limitations. The Sattvic mind wants expansion, wants to abide in peace. It naturally resists the natural limitations of the world. It detests them. The Sattvic mind is constantly trying to find ways to overcome suffering, overcome constraints, overcome limitations. And therefore, something that is very strongly embedded within us and constantly surfaces to our mind in way of aspiration, we will be very definitely moving towards. The people that have a Sattvic preponderance in the mind, they are dominantly Sattvic in their tendencies, they are constantly focused on freedom. Their minds are constantly analyzing how to attain greater level of freedom. They analyze their experiences in this way. How can I do what I do in a way which will lead to a greater level of freedom? Less limitations, less emotional bondage. This is what their minds are constantly analyzing. They are constantly focused on freedom, and therefore it is easy for them to attain liberation. Not because attaining liberation is easy. Attainment of the knowledge of the self is not easy. But if our mind is constantly focused on something, it will be relatively easy for us to accomplish it. So the result of the Sattvic tendencies of the mind is focus on freedom or the desire for liberation and perception of the limitations of worldly things. And therefore, it is easy for such a mind to move. Easy means it's natural for such a mind to move towards expansion, freedom, liberation, purity, stillness, peace. This is natural for such a mind to move towards those things. So this is how the Sattvic faith is coloring the world. It colors the world by way of the world is made for me to attain freedom. The world, the limitations of the world should be overcome. This is the Sattvic faith. Limitations exist not to be subservient to them, but to overcome them. Always, how can I overcome limitations? How can I have less bondage? How can I have more peace and happiness? How can I bring more peace and happiness to the world? Like this. The Sattvic mind is naturally moving in this direction. Why? The nature of its faith is such. This is why. It's its nature. So if we look at people that are spiritual seekers, they are dedicating their life to the spiritual pursuits, to the attainment of freedom. And we contemplate what makes these people be so dedicated to this spiritual goal. The answer is their faith. They perceive the world in this way. For them, it is natural. Moment by moment, as they look at the world, their mind is analyzing it by way of freedom and bondage, constantly. They look at the world as freedom and bondage. What is bondage? Meaning limitation, they try to overcome and put aside. They constantly try to move towards freedom. It's their nature. This is the nature of their faith. They perceive the world in this way. Their aspirations come from that place. Their desires come from that place. And their actions come from that place. This is what is explained. Then it is explained regarding the Rajasic faith. If Rajas is predominant, the faith becomes, Swami Sivananda gives a beautiful definition. He says if Rajas is predominant, the faith becomes the handmaid of activity. Okay, so if Rajas is predominant, the faith means the fundamental way of how this person perceives the world. So if there is dominance of Rajasic, vasanas, and samskaras, the faith of that person, the vision of how they perceive the world, becomes the handmaid of activity, which means the way they perceive the world becomes the servant of action, which means their minds will constantly motivate them to do, to accomplish. Okay, and Swami Sivananda clarifies, he says, those who are endowed with Rajasic faith run after inferior duties or worldly activities. So what is known as artha, kama, and perhaps dharma also, right? So we know that there are 4 purusharthas, the 4 goals of life that are defined in the Vedas. Artha, acquisition of wealth, possessions. Kama, fulfillment of desires for pleasure. And dharma, leading a righteous life. And then moksha, attainment of liberation. So when the mind is dominantly filled with Rajasic tendencies, vasanas and samskaras or impressions, then the mind will be naturally inclined to accomplish things. What things? Primarily of artha and kama, predominantly. Also of dharma, which means the mind will be focused more on worldly attainments. So the faith, the way that the mind will be colored by these vasanas, by these impressions, is that it will see the world as a world of opportunities to achieve. To achieve what? This type of mind, you see, the achievement of freedom comes from Sattvic tendencies. So if the mind is filled with rajas, it will be less focused on freedom. Or it will see freedom more in the sense of freedom from lacking possessions. So if I have enough possessions, if I have enough worldly resources, then I'm free. It will translate freedom also in a worldly sense, because it doesn't see the world a world of freedom and bondage like the Sattvic mind does. It translates freedom and bondage to freedom from physical or worldly lacking, and bondage means not having the resources I need to attain my worldly goals. This is how the Rajasic mind will perceive it. So the Rajasic mind will tend to see the things of the world as goals in and of themselves. Now, this is an important point, because everyone needs to attain worldly goals, right? This is common to all people. Doesn't matter who we are, whether we are living in the world, living in ashrams, whatever level of dedication we have to the spiritual goal, etc. Everyone needs to also pursue worldly goals to sustain their body, to sustain their institutions, to sustain their activities, etc. So this is common to all people to different degrees. But the point is, where is the focus? The focus again comes from the faith, right? So if the faith is dominantly Sattvic, then while the person goes through the performance of their duties in the world, their focus is always on freedom, meaning they utilize the performance of their duties for the acquisition of freedom or purity of mind. they don't see the worldly goals as goals in and of themselves. They see them as means to attain purity and ultimately freedom. Purity is freedom, relatively speaking, because when our mind is more pure, it's more free from suffering, right? From the afflictions of the mind. The negative qualities of the mind are less in a mind which is more pure. So the people that have, or the tendencies that are of Sattvic nature, will not tend to see the worldly goals as goals in and of themselves. Rather, they will see the performance of worldly duties, which everyone needs to do, this is common to all, as means to an end, and the end is always freedom, purity, peace, etc. Why does the Sattvic mind does not perceive the worldly goals as goals in and of themselves? Again, because it is introspective, it is far-sighted, it perceives the limitations inherent in those goals, such as impermanence, short-lived, limited, right? So whatever we attain in this world is very limited. It's of short duration, and it will never be really fulfilling. It comes and goes, right? So no one denies that there are good things we can enjoy in life, right? So good food, etc. But still, these are short-lived things, and they do not generate freedom. The freedom from the mental afflictions, they cannot give us. The Sattvic mind can understand this. The Rajasic mind, however, the Rajasic tendencies, more correctly to say, why it's more correct to say? Because minds have mixed tendencies, right? So we have different voices or inclinations within us, right? So the dominance is what is important. So we know that our minds have different inclinations. Some inclinations within us are motivating us towards freedom. These are the Sattvic ones. Some inclinations are motivating towards acquisition of worldly goals, as if they are goals in and of themselves, as if they will lead to fulfillment, right? This is why it's called worldly goals. So the Rajasic mind tends towards this pursuit. It tends to see the attainment of worldly projects as the goal in itself. Everyone has projects, right? Everyone has to-do lists, right? We know very well that to-do lists never end, right? This is called karma. So the more you go through your to-do lists, the more the tasks manifest more in your to-do lists, right? So therefore, if we look at it carefully, we notice that to see those projects, those impermanent attainments, as a goal in and of themselves is a little bit futile, because it doesn't give us anything long-lasting. But if we use our actions, projects, etc., as a common means for higher goals, such as the service of humanity, doing good in humanity, uplifting ourselves and other people, then everything receives a different meaning, right? So then we are motivating ourselves again towards freedom. So, but the Rajasic tendencies do not tend to see the projects and actions of life in this way. They tend to see them as fulfilling in and of themselves. Why? Because they are pleasure-driven, right? So what the Rajasic tendencies are seeking, being servants of the ego, they are seeking pleasure. Pleasure means they are seeking some type of acknowledgement, success, right? Worldly goals. There is nothing wrong with those goals. The point is, again, they are impermanent, they are short-lived, and mostly they are also imaginary, right? Which means they are conjured by our own mind. They are based on erroneous perceptions, right? So we may perceive it as success, etc. But maybe a better way, more accurate way to see it is this is a good contribution, right? Rather than success. But the Rajasic mind will tend, or the Rajasic tendencies will tend to interpret it more as to do with egotistic accomplishments, right? Which is the meaning of pleasure. So this is it. Now, why does the Rajasic mind tend to see the world as a world of opportunities to accomplish pleasures, to accomplish projects, to get success? It's its nature. Again, the same thing. Why is it? You see, this nature, the tendencies that are the results of the actions of the past, manifest as the way we perceive the world. So the Rajasic tendencies color the way we perceive the world. And when we look at the world, when we open our eyes and look at the world, we will see the world as a world of opportunities for worldly ends. Why? It's the nature of our mind. It's just like this. See, we perceive the world in this way. So again, the fundamental concept that this world is made up of faith. We each live in our own faith, created by our own nature, from which our aspirations arise, from which our desires manifest, from which our actions come forth, from which the way we contribute and leave our imprints on humanity are coming from, etc. Okay, so this is the idea. So then the Tamasic faith is described. And again, Swami Sivananda gives a beautiful definition. So again, right? So he said the Sattvic faith is focused on freedom, liberation. Why? It is constantly analyzing freedom and bondage. This is how it perceives the world. The Rajasic mind looks at the world as a world of worldly attainments. This is its nature. It is natural for it to perceive it like this. What is the Tamasic faith? Swami Sivananda says, if tamas or inertia prevails, right, dullness of mind, faith is annihilated. Right? This is so important. Right? Such a short, brief definition, but very powerful. Right? So the Sattvic faith motivates us higher to transcend the limitations of the world. It's the natural result of Sattvic tendencies to do this. The Rajasic faith motivates us to see the world as real, right? When we look at the projects and objects in the world as goals, the world becomes real for us, right? It's like this. So our own attachments to the objects of the world reaffirm the illusory reality of the world. The world appears real to us because we are interested in it. This is why, right? So whereas if we are interested in the self and to be free from the limitations of the world, it's a different type of setting for the mind. So, but when the mind is bent on achieving the objects of the world, naturally, the world appears to be real. Now, what is the result of the Tamasic faith? So, if tamas or inertia prevails, right? If there are Tamasic vasanas and samskaras dominating the mind, faith is annihilated. What does it mean? This is so important, right? So you see, both Sattvic and Rajasic people are motivated in their life. They are inspired. And this is extremely important, right? Sattvic people are motivated and inspired to attain freedom. They know because of their faith, because of the nature of their past tendencies, that freedom is the goal of life, and this world is a means to attain it. Then the Rajasic people are also motivated and inspired to attain worldly goals. This is very important, right? Because we have to exhaust our interest in the impermanent things of the world. So first of all, we have to be inspired to attain those things, and in a dharmic way, preferably, right? Because otherwise we are going to acquire more and more suffering. So, but the inspiration for life is present in the Rajasic mind, and that's extremely important. It has a vision, right? The faith is alive. In the Sattvic people, the faith has a deep, inspiring vision to it, which is of a divine spiritual nature. In the Rajasic people, they are also very inspired. Their faith and vision is more worldly, but still, they are very inspired. They would like to contribute to the world, even if it's egotistically. Still, they are inspired, motivated people, right? Of course, Rajas makes the mind more restless, more full of suffering, etc. But still, there is motivation, there is inspiration, right? There is energy to do things, etc. Faith generates energy. But in the Tamasic tendencies, it's a different story, right? So if tamas or inertia prevails, faith is annihilated. The vision that feeds the energy for life, the energy to act, the aspiration to act, is annihilated. So they become faithless, which means having no vision or motivation to inspire them. Okay, so this is very different from the first two, right? Because the first two are motivated. The Tamasic tendencies are very different. They extinguish the faith. The vision of life is removed. The mind becomes an aimless mind, right? And then this is a totally different story, right? So this is described also in, you see, because when the mind is faithless, remember, we're not talking about atheism here, right? Let's say people that are not believing, philosophically speaking, in God or this type of things. We are talking about lacking a vision, lacking motivation. The faith that we are talking about is fundamental, right? It's the fundamental thing from which our life springs. So when the mind is dominated by Tamasic tendencies, the faith is extinguished. The mind becomes aimless. It has no goal. It doesn't see anything good to accomplish in the world. And therefore, these minds or these tendencies tend to cause problems for those people and for the world, right? So as Lord Krishna says in chapter 16, the previous chapter, he says when this Tamasic tendency becomes very powerful, then those people come as the enemies of the world, right? So they cause destruction in the world. Why? They have no vision. They have no faith. They see nothing good in the world. And therefore, they don't have any aspiration to contribute. And therefore, naturally, their minds gravitate into wrong places. Okay? Now, Swami Sivananda continues to explain how the faith is created from our past actions. So he says, as is the tendency or the vasana, right? Tendencies are like the deep undercurrents of the mind, right? If the mind is like an ocean, a vast ocean, right? There are so many things in this mind. The vasanas are like the undercurrents of the mind. And just like in the ocean, there are many types of currents, right? There are more local currents, which are not that strong. And there are very deep currents in the ocean, which are extremely powerful. So it's the same with vasanas. We have many types of tendencies in our mind. Some of them are more superficial and therefore easier to overcome. Some are very deep-rooted and difficult to overcome. So we have different depth of tendencies or vasanas in our mind. It's a little bit like archaeological layers. Okay, so as is the tendency or the vasana, so is the desire, right? So these tendencies, they are also called subtle desires. Vasanas are called subtle desires. Subtle in the sense that they are hidden. They operate in the subconscious mind like undercurrents, and they give rise to the desires in the conscious mind, our aspirations. They force desires into our mind. These are called vasanas. So as is the tendency of vasana, so is the desire. As is the desire, so is the action. Desires motivate us to act. Okay, so these vasanas, deeply embedded in our mind, right? We also call them karmic tendencies. What is karmic tendencies? Karmic tendencies means, think about it. Let's say that there is some food that you develop a liking to, right? You, at some point you are exposed to this very tasty food, and then you develop a liking, right? You become attached to it, and you eat it frequently. So you get attached to it, which means your mind, right, from attachments, desires come. How do you know that you are attached to this food? Your mind is frequently desiring it. That's how you know that there is an attachment there. Now, this attachment was created now, recently, right? A few years ago, a few months ago, whatever it may be. Now, see the power of this attachment, right? It's recent. Still, even if you try to resist it, you will feel the power that is behind this attachment. Now imagine tendencies that are there for lives together, life after life after life. They are there operating in the mind. So imagine the momentum in those vasanas. They are tremendously powerful. Okay, so these tendencies operate in our mind. These are called karmic tendencies. Desires spring out of those vasanas. From these desires, the desires compel us to act. Okay, so this is the meaning. As is the action, so is the birth. Okay, so as we perform our actions, so will be the fruit of our actions, right? The karma palam, the fruit of the action. The fruit of the action manifests as the future birth. This is the fruit, right? So for example, our body, the current body that we are in, is a fruit of action. It's a karmic fruit, right? It's not that the body has karma. The body is a result of karma, right? This body that we have and the conditions, the genetics in it, the place we are born, the family, etc. All these things the inherent tendencies in our mind, all these are the results of prarabdha karma, the present life karma. So this body is a fruit of karma. The future body is also a fruit of karma. Of which karmas? Of previous karmas, right? The actions that we are doing now will determine the future. So, you see, but the actions that we are doing now are not completely free. There is free will inherently in us, right? All of us have inherently free will, free choice. But the tendencies are very powerful. They act in us as desires, they push us to act, and these actions become fruits of actions which become future births, future bodies, life circumstances, and this is called the cycle of samsara. So life after life, we are reaping these fruits of actions, and these tendencies, these vasanas, these deep-rooted karmic currents are behind it. See, and a beautiful way to look at it, which is very practical, is look at one day, right? In one day, we have all sorts of aspirations to accomplish different things, right? We have our to-do lists, and we do what we need to do pertaining to our daily routine, etc. Then nighttime comes. Nighttime is the end of the day. It's, in a sense, it's like the death of the day, right? So the day is like life, and then the day comes to an end. End is like death, right? So we come to the end of the day. But when you come to the end of the day, you notice when you go to sleep, as you must, because the force of sleep is gradually making you more and more drowsy. It's pulling you to move away from activity, right? But only temporarily. Why? All these aspirations, all the momentum of your actions is not going away when you go to sleep. It's very much alive, right? So although temporarily we are pulled into the state of sleep to gain some rest, etc., the momentum of action is very much alive in us, and it awakens in the morning when we are woken up. And again, it comes with full momentum. And another day. It's exactly the same with life after life. Because think about it. This life continues. At some point, right, when we are in the height of our youth, etc., we are very motivated to act, right? Maybe a little bit naively in the beginning of our life. Gradually, we learn a little bit more about the world. Certain tendencies begin to ripen in our mind, and we have a mission to accomplish here. Then gradually, we grow older. As we grow older, we tend to have a tendency of retirement, right? We have a tendency of gradually moving away from action. Naturally, because our bodies have less energy to do, but also our mind gradually develops some type of aloofness, right? So it's not only physically, not only the physical energy, but the energy of action in our mind begins to decrease, but temporarily. You see, because the vasanas, the momentum of action is not gone. And even when the body dies, these vasanas are very much alive. And they are going to push the mind to another body to re-experience or to fulfill more fruits of actions, more desires. You see, it's a natural process, just like day and night or wakefulness and sleep. we have life and death. And the motivating force behind both is vasanas, the momentum behind action. Karmic tendencies propels us from one life to another life to accomplish more. But what determines what type of actions, what type of aspirations we are going to have in each life? Again, these are these vasanas. This is the faith that we are speaking about. This deep-rooted nature of the impressions and tendencies of ours is manifesting as the way we perceive the world, as the way we act in the world. Okay, so now Swami Sivananda explains that this cycle continues until one gets knowledge of the self, knowledge of the Atman, the real self. By transcending the three gunas, when ignorance, the root cause of birth and death, is destroyed. Okay, so what does it mean? So briefly, ignorance is defined as the non-discrimination between the self and the non-self, right? So when we cannot tell the difference between consciousness, the self is pure consciousness, and the material nature of creation, which includes the mind, the ego, which is part of the mind, the I, aham, the body, the senses, and the world. All these are part of the material nature of the world, which is known as anatma. Anatma means the non-self, right? So when we cannot discriminate between the self and the non-self, we take the non-self to be self. Okay, so we tend to take the mind to be the self. We tend to take the ego, right, which is the individual I-ness, or the reflection of the self in the mind. We tend to see it as the self, right? We tend to see the mind as the origin of awareness, which it's not, right? When we learn to meditate, we learn to perceive the mind, to notice that actually I'm the one who knows the mind, right? If I'm the one who knows the mind, then knowledge or awareness is not originating in the mind, right? Which is the foundation of egoism. The foundation of egoism, or the false identity, is awareness originates in the mind. This is how we experience ourselves now, right? Awareness originates in the limited vehicle of the mind. Or we may translate it as awareness originates in the brain, right? So it's the same thing. So the point is that we cannot discriminate, or we cannot tell the difference between the true nature of the I am, consciousness, and what it is not. We cannot tell the difference between the real knower and the known. We take the known to be the knower. We take the mind to be the knower. We take the body to be the knower. We take the senses to be the knower, like this. So this is ignorance. When we attain knowledge of the self by learning to discriminate, to tell the difference between the self and the non-self, then we can break the cycle of bondage, the cycle of karma, and attain the transcendence of the gunas, which means realize that the self is ever free and is untouched by the play of the gunas. Okay? So this state, Lord Krishna calls in the Gita the gunatita. Gunatita means the one that transcends the gunas. The gunas are still operating like they do in the ignorant person, but the ignorant person identifies consciousness with the gunas, whereas the realized, the enlightened person knows the self as being distinct from the material nature or the gunas, which include the mind, the body, etc. So now, how do we attain this knowledge of the self? So first of all, we need to attain purity of mind, right? Because the only reason why we identify wrongly with the non-self, with the anatma, is because of impurities in the mind. Right? Think about it. The impurities of the mind, you see, the impurities of the mind originate in ignorance, in avidya. For example, if I desire certain food, desire arises from ignorance, right? The self has no desires in it. The self is ever full, ever free. The self is of the nature of infinite bliss, which means it has no limitation, right? Desires have to do with limitations. If I experience limitation of some sort, I desire to remove this limitation. This is what underlies desires. So Swami Sivananda says what underlies desire is lack of ananda, lack of bliss, lack of happiness. So, but the nature of the self is ananda, is unlimited happiness or bliss. So desire has nothing to do with the self, but because of ignorance, desires arise. Now, these desires reaffirm the sense of being limited, right? So when we run after desires, we are reaffirming, yes, I am limited. Yes, my happiness does depend on external things. So so the impurities arise from ignorance and they reaffirm ignorance. This is the meaning. Okay, so therefore we need to purify the mind. And when we purify the mind by leading a dharmic life, by following the moral codes set forth in the scriptures of yoga and Vedanta, then we are gradually purifying our mind, and purity of mind will result in discrimination, right? So we will be able to gradually move away from the mind being lost in the worldly achievements, being lost in the world, that asserts the identity with the body and that the world is real. And gradually, when the mind moves towards more and more sattva, as we saw, it becomes more and more disengaged with worldly goals, and freedom becomes its goal or pursuit. So the more the mind becomes pure, the more it perceives the limitations with which the world is fraught. You see, the world is filled with limitations. The Rajasic mind is not so much looking at it. The Sattvic mind is. When we purify the mind, then we move more and more towards seeking freedom from limitations, as we mentioned. This will gradually lead to discrimination, to dispassion, because we become dispassionate from all the limited, impermanent things of the world, and ultimately we desire to attain the unlimited self. So we translate the quest for happiness, instead of being objectified to seeking the objects of the world, we translate the quest of happiness to a quest for knowledge, knowledge of the self. Okay, so we understand that happiness means freedom, freedom from limitations. Why? Because our very nature is that happiness or bliss. So all we need to do is to remove the limitations that we falsely identify with, right? What is called upadis, the false limitations that we identify with. Now, see, this is not simple It is not simple because this ignorant way of looking at the world is deeply embedded in our mind. You see, this is a very important point. Why is it so difficult to purify the mind and to attain knowledge? You see, because when we are ignorant, moment by moment, our mind generates impressions which are filled with ignorance, filled with the vision of duality. What is ignorance? Ignorance translates to duality, to the experience that I am limited to this body and mind, that I have an independent existence, right? So I cannot see the one reality behind all names and forms. Rather, I see all names and forms, all beings, as having independent reality or an independent self to them, right? So this is called duality. I have a separate independent existence, and so are all other beings or all other names and forms, right? So we see the reality pervading everywhere, but we perceive that reality as limited to the names and forms that we perceive, right? So this is a separate name and form, and so are all the others. This is called ignorance. So ignorance, which means identifying the self with the non-self, generates the sense of duality or the names and forms of creation having a separate independent existence to them. This translates also to a separate self. I am who I think I am. You are who you think you are, like this. So the world of duality is the world of ignorance, right? So now think about it. Moment by moment, our mind, like a recorder, is accumulating impressions, right? These impressions are gradually piling up or joining other impressions and creating like plexuses or complexes of impressions, which we call vasanas. The mind becomes entangled in those vasanas. They are also sometimes called knots, right? They are like the knots of the heart. So these impressions and tendencies are recording the perception that we have. Now, the perception that we have has to do with duality. You see, I am experiencing the world, right? So the impressions that we have of the world are embedded or generated by duality or ignorance, subject and object, right? And the objects are real. And because they are real, I desire them. I get attached to them. See? If I know that the objects are not real, which means they do not have a separate, independent existence from the underlying reality which I am, then the desire for it will fall away because I know this is not separate from me. The underlying reality which underlies both me, the individual, and this form, this object, is one reality, and I am that reality. If this knowledge is not there, and I appear to be an independent being and I observe an independent real object, then immediately I desire that object. If it's an object of pleasure. If I perceive the object as an object of pain, then I will have aversion towards it, right? Raga and Vesha. So Raga and Vesha reassert the reality of the world. So now, we perceive the world in this dualistic way. In this dualistic way, all the afflictions of the mind are operating. We have desires, we have attachments, we have negative emotions, all based on ignorance, all emerge from the sense that I am a separate independent being, observing a separate independent world of objects, which therefore I must have, I am forced to have relationships with. relationships based on ignorance, which means I either desire them or I have aversions towards them, I'm afraid of them, I am jealous of them, I hate them, etc., etc., etc. Okay? Now, all the while we experience the world in this way, our mind is recording impressions. These just much like a camera. These impressions are accumulated into tendencies or vasanas. Now, which type of impressions? Impressions that are embedded in the vision of duality or ignorance. So why is it very difficult to remove ignorance? Because ignorance is found in every one of the impressions and vasanas or tendencies of our mind. This is why. So this ignorance is pervading our mind to its very core and depth. And even if we try to develop a clear vision of reality through meditation, through inquiry, through cultivation of virtues, etc., when the vasanas arise in the mind through desires, they reassert and reaffirm ignorance from which they came, you see? So the problem is that these deep-rooted tendencies, again, which we mentioned, are making it difficult to shift. But we can shift. How can we shift? So both yoga and Vedanta emphasize devotion as a very important foundation for our sadhana, bhakti. And this bhakti, Swami Sivananda and Swami Vishnudevananda explained the most essential feature of bhakti, or the fulfillment of bhakti, the strength of bhakti, the real meaning of bhakti is self-surrender to God, taking refuge in Ishvara, in God. Why is it so important? For the very reason that we mentioned now. Think about it. We are perceiving the world as we do, according to our faith, which pervades every perception, thought, emotion, memory, desire that we have. It's so deeply embedded. Everything we perceive in the world is colored by it, whether we know it or not. Now, this will manifest as desires and actions, which are going to generate fruits of actions, more births, more bodies, etc., etc. So we can understand that we are dealing with very powerful forces, much like, exactly like we said, much like the deep undercurrents of the ocean, right? So therefore, if we understand this, we have to take refuge or seek the grace of the one behind all this mechanism. Swami Sivananda says something very important. He says it is the Atman which is activating the vasanas in the mind and pushing them as desires into the mind. So these forces, much like the natural forces of the world, gravitation, electricity, etc., who operates them? You see, who operates the forces behind our mind? Because if all these forces operate in our mind, are we operating those forces? Right? Those forces operate within us, right? Just like, am I operating the heartbeat in my body, right? So Swami Sivananda says, he says, you want to see God? He says, just open your eyes. He says, listen to your heartbeat. Why? Are you the doer of your heartbeat, right? look at your hair growing. This is not Swami Sivananda doesn't say, give the example of the hair, but it's the same thing, right? Look at your hair growing. In the same way, look at your thoughts rising in the mind. Look at the emotions rising in your mind. Look at the infinite complexity of activity in your body. There is someone that is performing all those actions. Someone is bringing forth these tendencies into manifestation as desires in your mind. Who is it? It is Ishvara, right? In the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna tells Arjuna that I am, or Ishvara is, the karma phala datta. I am the dispenser of the fruits of actions. So those karmic forces come into fruition or manifestation not by themselves. It is the Lord or Ishvara which governs them. The Lord or Ishvara governs the fruition or manifestation of these forces in our life. So the desirable and undesirable experiences of our life, which are the results of our punyas or positive karmas and papas or the negative karmas of the past. These experiences that all of us are bound to experience, the pairs of opposites of the world, are brought to us by Ishvara, by the Lord. And therefore, self-surrender or taking refuge in Ishvara, which means, what does it mean? It means recognizing that all this fruition of experiences, of karmas, come from Ishvara. In this sense, we can look at them as the grace of Ishvara, Ishvara Prasada. And in this sense, understanding that this comes from the one that we are devoted to, the Supreme Being. The Supreme Being, therefore, has its way and course for our own evolution. Our own evolution is determined by the infinite intelligence of Ishvara, which is manifesting through the fruition of the past actions in the form of manifestation of vasanas, desires, experiences, etc. So therefore, Lord Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita emphasizes the surrender to Ishvara. Because if we understand this mechanism, our individual will is not sufficient, is way not sufficient. We need to surrender to the infinite power behind these forces, the one that generates it with infinite love and intelligence. Surrendering to it, we develop equanimity of mind. It is called samatvam or prasada buddhi, the awareness that all these experiences are the grace of God. And therefore we can attain to peace and be accepting, and therefore purify by devotion and offering these fruits of actions to the Lord. Okay, so here we will conclude. Yeah, we'll conclude this and then we will accept questions, if there are any. Yes. So we are going to bring the sound in so we can hear the questions.
Yes, Swamiji.
Okay, so we have the sound on. So if there are any questions,
Sure, Swami.
we'll do my best to answer.
Bahut dhanyawadaha for a very detailed insight into Shraddha, its relationship with the desires, the vasanas. In fact, as I was listening to you, I felt that this is a subject of depth psychology, We should be very much be part of the psychology discipline which students should study. It's so profound in its nature.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Swamiji, for joining us and also bringing with you the grace of Ma Saraswati, Swami Sivananda, and Swami Vishnu Devananda along. Thank you very much for this.
Thank you.
In fact, for the benefit of all our participants who joined us a little later, I would like to once again introduce Swamiji. You heard him speak uh, who has such an in-depth knowledge of the Shastras. Swami Brahmananda is the senior faculty of the Sivananda Yoga Vedanta organization, and he's also the manager of Sivananda Ashram Yoga Retreat, which is located in a very beautiful place in the Bahamas in the Caribbean islands. A long-time practitioner of yoga, he regularly teaches yoga philosophy and meditation for the Sivananda Yoga teacher training courses, as well as the other philosophy courses. In fact, I would like to say this, the Sivananda Yoga teacher training course was one of the oldest teacher training programs that was started. In fact, way back in the late 60s, Swami Vishnu Devananda ji started these courses. In fact, much of the yogic knowledge in the West, in fact, we see the movement of yoga to the West in various waves and cycles. And one of the biggest waves that was created in the West was by Swami Vishnu Devananda ji. So Swami Brahmananda comes in that tradition and brings the grace of the great masters along with him. He's a much loved, inspiring, and knowledgeable teacher. We were really fortunate to have you, Swamiji, with us today. Thank you very much.
Oh, no, sure.
So with this, I'll move on to questions. We have a few questions. And in fact, there was one question which was going on in my mind. And I also see Sri Ramakrishnan Sitaramanji has presented this question. He's asking, especially about the usage of the word, translating word Shraddha in English is such a challenging task. So he says, don't you think using faith as a synonym for Shraddha in the title of the chapter 17 is rather problematic because of the other connotations of faith in English language, especially coming from other traditions, the Semitic traditions? There is a particular understanding of Shraddha, particular understanding of the word faith. So how best can we define it, or how can we understand it?
Yes, definitely. Therefore, Swami Sivananda takes the time to clarify this point by stating that what is meant by faith here is a different type of faith from what we usually understand. And therefore, he begins his commentary to this second verse of chapter 17 by saying that the whole world is made up, as it were, of faith. To explain to us that what is meant is that deep nature. And then he explains that faith is the deeply embedded vasanas and samskaras, etc. So it can be misleading to use the word faith.
True.
On the other hand, there is also a beauty to it and practicality to it because it shows us something very beautiful. Faith also translates, right, in the spiritual setting, we can say faith translates as devotion, as bhakti, this we know. But even in a more general way, each one has something they are devoted to, whether it's not a religious concept or even a spiritual seeking. So where is their devotion or commitment or dedication to what they are dedicated to? Can be something that we totally cannot understand. How come this person is dedicated to what they are dedicated? Again, it comes from this inherent faith. So in some way, it can be misleading because usually what we understand of Shraddha is in a more limited way. On the other hand, it also throws light of how important it is to have the correct knowledge and understanding, to have the proper aspirations. In another place, I will end with this answer. Swami Sivananda has a beautiful writing about God in his book, Bliss Divine. In that article or essay, he says something very profound. and again, he relates not only to religious seekers or spiritual aspirants, he relates to, and he makes it very clear that he relates to everyone. And he says, your understanding of what God is the most important thing that governs your whole life. And this is the reason. This faith is governing the whole way of how we understand the world and what is the highest good in the world. Therefore, what are we aspiring for? So it is very deeply connected into the Shraddha in the more immediate sense that all of us understand, but it's broader. So an explanation needs to be given. Yeah.
Swamiji, if I just as a follow-up question to this, how would you like to define, because translating into one word could be problematic, as you said, but if you have to put it in a very brief sentence, a statement of definition, how can we say it? What is the best way to define Shraddha in English in a very simple statement?
I think also it has to do with the context of the message we want to convey about it. But I would say the most generalized definition would be that which we are devoted to or committed to emotionally, mentally, and in our actions.
So connecting with that at all the three levels, through the word, thought, and action.
Definitely.
Thank you very much, Swamiji, for that. Going further, we have a question from Yamini Singh Ji, who is asking, you explained about the gunas and the whole role it plays, and especially it appears so much in the Bhagavad Gita. So would you like to recommend any good text or translation of the Gita, which would be very easy and approachable for the beginners?
Definitely. To understand, to have a in-depth understanding of the Bhagavad Gita, I would recommend two books. One is a book of Swami Sivananda, which is called All About Hinduism. All About Hinduism. It gives a very beautiful review of all the philosophical ideas and foundations of all religious systems, philosophical systems of India, yoga, Vedanta, what is dharma, and this will give a very good foundation to understand. And it's a book which is written in a way to give foundation, and therefore it's not too difficult. So All About Hinduism of Swami Sivananda. It can also be found on the Divine Life Society website for free download. And the other book is Practice of Karma Yoga, again of Swami Sivananda. Again, it gives a very strong foundation to understand karma yoga, karma and karma yoga, which then allows to have a very solid understanding of the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. So I think these two books can be very good to give a foundation.
So just to repeat, I have typed in the question, the names of the books. One is The Practice of Karma Yoga by Swami Sivananda, and the other one is All About Hinduism, again by Swami Sivananda.
Yes.
So going further, we have a question from Rajesh Ji, who is asking, what tendencies remain after they are fulfilled in a Rajasic and in a Sattvic man?
Again,
what tendencies would still continue to remain after the purpose has been achieved in a Sattvic man, especially because the guna is also connected with the vasanas and the tendencies that come out of it. And if he's already a sattva predominant person, what kind of tendencies would still continue?
Okay, so you see, evolution is a continuous organic process, basically. So what does it mean? We evolve from being more ignorant, which means our mind is more pervaded by limiting wrong ideas, which means Tamasic. Right? So the more we have Tamasic tendencies, our mind is less illuminated with clarity, with intelligence. Therefore, also we suffer more, right? Tamas also manifests as more afflictions, more states of suffering. And then gradually, the mind becomes more and more Rajasic. It attains more and more clarity. It has more inspiration to act. It's more positive, right? In order to act in the world. So in the beginning, we may act in the world very selfishly. This may be the lower levels of Rajas and more Tam, because it's very confined. So maybe we have a lot of desire to act, which is very good, but it's still very much enclosed within ourselves. Gradually, Rajas is moving towards Sattva, and there are more and more positive aspirations for ourselves and for others, right? Positive aspirations for ourselves are also Sattvic, right? So if we want to act for our own well-being of our closed ones, friends, family, etc., this is already manifestation of Sattva, because goodness is motivating us, and goodness is purity, is Sattva. So gradually, as we move along, gunas change predominance, and we are moving more and more towards Sattva. There are still Rajasic tendencies in the mind, but it's all about dominance. Right? This is why Swami Sivananda, in his introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, he writes, the war of Kurukshetra, the war of the Bhagavad Gita, is not only an historic event, but it's a spiritual teaching. It's an analogy to the war that rages within every human heart. And what is the war? He says you have the forces of knowledge, or Sattva, that are combating the forces of Rajas and Tamas. And this is inevitable. So because we have mixing of tendencies, then the Rajasic forces will tend to pull the mind down, and the Sattvic forces will call the mind to come up, and the aspirant needs to develop discrimination and willpower to gradually identify or discriminate between Sattva and Rajas and Tamas, to know the difference between them, what is right and what is wrong. But this is the foundation of a life of dharma, following moral codes, moral precepts, etc. By following those things, we learn, right? In the beginning, we don't know. So the scriptures guide us. This is also why Lord Krishna tells Arjuna, in matter of what is right and what is wrong, consult the scriptures, right? The scriptures lay down what is dharma, what is right to do, what is wrong to do. So by following the scriptures, gradually the mind learns to distinguish what is right and what is wrong, and it becomes a natural trait for the mind to follow dharma. So therefore, following dharma strengthens the Sattvic tendencies of the mind. And not only that, even if there are, and there are, of course, because the mind is a mixture, there are Rajasic tendencies, there is sufficient willpower not to cooperate with them, right? So this is called tapas, restraint, right? So the yogi needs to do tapas. Tapas means to withstand the assaults of the mind, right? In the Upanishads, there is a beautiful word that describes the enlightened yogi, the sage. And the word is the person that the person that is not afflicted by his own desires. So it doesn't mean that the desires are not there, but the mind is totally unperturbed by them, right? So whereas a mind which identifies with the operations of the gunas is very much afflicted by its own desires. So the yogi becomes free. So the more there is sattva in the mind, sattva is like a clear glass, so we can see through it. When we see through it, we begin to understand our true nature, which is beyond the mind, beyond the gunas, and therefore we are less troubled, we are less afflicted, we less identify with the operations of the mind. They may be there, but we are less afflicted by them. Ultimately, when we attain knowledge of the self, we are not afflicted by them at all.
Thank you very much, Swamiji, for that. But is this progression linear in nature, or it goes through its own cycles?
Yes, it definitely goes through its own cycles. So why? Because the gunas are evolving in the mind. You see, what does it mean? From ignorance, from avidya, manifest, right? So we have ignorance. Ignorance generates desires, right? Because we experience ourselves to be limited. So from ignorance, because we experience ourselves to be a body mind, naturally desires will come. The body has limitations. The mind has limitations. The body will crave food, etc. The mind will crave entertainment, whatever will allow it to disengage from its own afflictions, to forget itself, so to say. So naturally desires will be there from ignorance. These desires lead to actions or karmas, right? And then from these karmas, we are going to experience the pairs of opposite, etc. So now, when the karmas manifest, you see, the karmas manifest, as we mentioned, from vasanas arising into the mind, and they manifest as vrittis, as thoughts. Now, different karmas manifest, you see. So where are the gunas of the mind embedded in? They are embedded in the fruition of karmas. So these vasanas and samskaras have the gunas within them, which means we have Sattvic vasanas and samskaras, Rajasic ones and Tamasic ones. Now, when they manifest in the mind, they push the mind towards this certain guna, right? So we may be at a peaceful state because of sattva. Sattva operates in our mind. But this is temporary. It's temporary because as long as we are ignorant, the fruition of karmas will be continuous in our mind, and other gunas will come. When Raja guna comes in the mind, it will suppress sattva guna, and suddenly our mind will become afflicted. You see? So there is a revolution. But saying that, the more we purify the mind, the less scope there is for the Rajasic and Tamasic tendencies to manifest. You see, because just like seeds in the field, they need proper conditions to manifest. So when we purify the mind more and more, there are less conditions for these afflictions to manifest in the mind. So gradually, the mind is moving towards more and more steadiness of sattva. This is true. Still, there will be revolution of the gunas in the mind because of the fruition of the karmas. As long as ignorance is there, it's a must. It must come from our prarabdha karma. From our, the fruition of our own karma is such that it will generate the fruition of past actions, which are also of a Rajasic Tamasic nature. This is inevitable. So, therefore, there is revolution, but there is also an ongoing process of gradual acquisition of more and more and more and more purity.
So it's almost like a spiral.
It is.
It moves in two dimensions.
It is exactly like a spiral, but the spiral, Swami Sivananda says, uses this analogy, The spiral is going upwards. So each time that you move in the same area, you are not in the same height. You are a little bit higher. So you see the same scenery again. So, oh, again, the mind is afflicted. But you have a little bit higher perspective now than you did the last time when you went through the same affliction. See? So you have a little bit more insight. So yes, it is like a spiral, but like a spiral, it moves upwards. That's the idea.
And with each higher level, there is a greater degree of freedom and joy, as you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. The being higher means greater level of dispassion, greater level of not identifying, of freedom. Not only that, also even gaining wisdom. See, there's something very profound that Swami Sivananda says, because we need to have some both consolation and vision in regards to afflictions. You see, because afflictions are there. Swami Sivananda says something very profound. He says, in your weaknesses lies your greatest strength. What does it mean? The limitations imposed on you will motivate you to break free. You see? So, therefore, if you look at it, fear, take fear. Fear is such an enormous limitation, right? But what is fear? Fear truly is pointing us towards fearlessness, you see? Because as long as we experience fear, no one wants to be fearful. So the strength of fearlessness will gradually emerge from fear. See, fear is a disturbance, but this disturbance is really pushing us towards becoming free from it. You see? So the secret of the afflictions is that if we gain wisdom about them, and this is the importance also of self-surrender, because self-surrender allows us to get with the afflictions which we will experience for sure, with those afflictions, we will get some form of wisdom and insight also, which is very important, right? So it allows us to gradually grow out of being bound to those experiences, which is exactly what we want. So therefore, it's consoling to understand that as long as we hold on to sadhana, as long as we hold on to devotion to God, to our guru, etc., there is the scope of evolving and learning from our suffering. Our suffering teaches us that we truly want freedom from limitations. We truly want to break free from those limitations. So even the afflictions are pointing our mind in this direction.
True. Thank you very much, Swamiji. This is a very profound insight that afflictions, which are also associated with pain and suffering, are the surest means to point towards self-reflection, and they provide the scope for growth.
Yes.
In a very intense manner. Thank you very much for that. I'll move on to next question again by Ramkrishnanji. Again, this was also in my mind, so I see him connected more to this. He's asking, at the surface level, the behavioral expression or the outer expression of someone who is in sattva mode of action and in the tamasic mode of action, they seem to be very similar. So it's quite possible for someone to be self-deceptive. Like, this is one of the biggest limitations for, or considerations for all of us in the spiritual journey, that we should not be self-deceptive, because we should be able to clearly find out where our position is and how do we move forward. So what would be your guidance for this, to know where we are and whether it is a sattva mode of action or it is a tamasic mode of action?
Yes, so Swami Sivananda has a beautiful analogy to explain this very point. So first of all, he says, yes, extremes at times tend to look alike. And he gives the following analogy for the gunas. He says, imagine a wheel of spokes, like a bicycle wheel. And it says when the wheel is at a standstill, this is tamas, right? No energy, inertia. When the wheel is standing still, this is tamas. When the wheel is rotating, this is rajas. When the wheel is rotating so fast, it appears to be still, this is sattva. Okay, so meaning, sattva is intense activity, right? So as we go through rajas, the mind becomes more and more and more active. Sattva is at the very end of the scale. Activity is at its maximum, but the difference between the activity of sattva and rajas is exactly like the spokes wheel. The spokes wheel, which is extremely fast, is appearing still. It's very coherent. So the activity of the Rajasic mind is all over the place. It's dissipated. It's governed by desires, right? So the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna explains this. He says the will of the power behind action of the Rajasic mind is focused on many, many, many goals. Therefore, it's not focused because the mind has so many goals, it's dissipated over many goals. Whereas the mind of the karma yogi, in the context of the explanation, the mind of the yogi is always focused on freedom. In whatever they are looking for, it's freedom that they are seeking, not the thing in and of itself. And therefore, their mind is focused. So in the same way, sattva tends to see the one goal in everything that in all its pursuits, in everything that it seeks. So therefore, the mind of sattva is extremely active, which means it has tremendous energy, right? If we see great teachers, they do so much, they act so much for the benefit of humanity. Their minds are so powerful, but their minds are very coherent. They are very peaceful. They are like the eye of the storm, right? So there is lots of activity, but there is total groundedness in the peace of the self, in the clear vision, while they are so active. Therefore, they are not disturbed or distracted by this activity. This is the difference. The Rajasic mind is lost in the pursuit of desires, and therefore it's ever swayed by the pairs of opposites and by its own likes and dislikes, whereas the Sattvic mind is very deeply grounded in the self, but very intensely active, very coherent. This is the meaning.
Thank you very much, Swamiji. If I am permitted to add, Swami Vishnudevanand was known as the peace activist. In fact,
Exactly.
on one side, you can see his Sattvic nature, but on other side, you could see how active he was. In fact, he was known for the peace flights that he took to Northern Ireland when there was a lot of violence. And he also moved from West Berlin to East Berlin, where people advised him not to do so. Yet he was one of the ones who took that risk. And again, when the wall was broken, he was again there to celebrate it. So this was Swami Vishnudevananda, where you can see
Yes.
when that sattva mode is there. Yes, Swamiji.
Yes, he was like, he was the embodiment of Bhagavad Gita, which means it was the embodiment of activity, which is totally pure for the upliftment of oneself and others. So all his life was an embodiment of Bhagavad Gita, literally. This was Swami Vishnudevananda.
Would you like to say anything about him, a little more about him, and if you had any experiences with him?
Personally, I joined this organization after the passing of Swami Vishnudevananda. So I did not know him directly. And Swami Vishnudevananda, you can see is mind in the organization that he left and the mission that he left. And what you see is tremendous power of action.
True.
Unbelievable power of action, all motivated for increasing our capacity in sadhana, controlling our own mind, and always utilized for the service of humanity, which was exactly Swami Sivananda. Right? Swami Sivananda was, in his messages, he always exhorted, be a dynamic yogi. Right? What he meant by be a dynamic yogi, he meant be a yogi in the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. This is how he explained it, which means, he said that the time for yogis to be in caves is pretty much over. Yogis need to be up and doing and helping in the service of humanity, which was exactly the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. This was the message of Swami Sivananda. This was very much the message of Swami Sivananda. And specifically, as you mentioned, Swami Vishnudevananda dedicated his life for the message of unity in diversity, which means the yogic vision is the vision of the oneness behind the diversity. The fact that the diversity of creation, which includes any type of diversity, ethnical, racial, religious, national, any diversity that we see, is not contrary to the oneness of reality or the self, but the very opposite. It is the very manifestation thereof. So the more the diversity, the more the infinite one, which bears in itself infinite potential, is fulfilled. So therefore, a lot of the work of Swami Vishnudevananda was the work of peace, to teach that in order to attain external peace and well-being for humanity, that everyone can live happily and promote their own well-being and the well-being of their own communities, etc., one needs, first of all, to work for their own inner peace, right? So, like Mahatma Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. So this was very much the message of Swami Vishnudevananda. But the power of Swami Vishnudevananda is that he was this dynamic yogi, which means it didn't speak much. Its strength was action. Everything that he taught was in action. And this can be very visible in the organization that he left. And this is this organization of the Sivananda Yoga Vedanta centers, the True World Order. And through his life, he propagated the teachings of Swami Sivananda in the West and all over the world, as other great yogis did as well.
Thank you, Swamiji, for sharing your experiences and sharing about the life of Swami Vishnudevananda. In fact, every time I look into their lives, especially Swami Sivananda and Swami Vishnudevananda, it's so fascinating. Like while they were so anchored inside, but they were so active also in the external world. Across the American contact, the way Swami Vishnudevananda worked, and he inspired, touched and transformed the lives of people, whether it was Beatles or Dr. Dean Ornish. Like the big wave of yoga was influenced by, the first one was by Swami Vivekananda. We saw it yesterday, we had a session on Swami Vivekananda. And the second big wave, I think, was by Swami Vishnudevananda. Thank you for highlighting those aspects.
Yes, yes.
So in the interest of time, I'll just take one more question, and I have a request for you after that.
Yes.
Normally, like the tendency, while all the texts, shastras, they lead us through to the sattva mode of action, from the tamas to rajas to sattva, but there is also a greater emphasis laid on being gunatita. In the Gita itself, it says even the Vedas, they belong to the gunas, the world of the gunas, and for you, you need to be beyond the gunas, nistraigunyo bhavarjuna. And elsewhere also the concept or the need to be Gunatita is highlighted so much. I would request you to kindly explain this a little more for us. You mentioned it earlier, but why is Sattva not good enough to be in? Why should one go beyond Sattva also to the Gunatita stage?
Yeah. Um, because ultimately, what we seek is freedom from limitation, right? So suffering is the idea. You see, there is no inherent limitation in the self, in the Atman. The Atman is what we call Ananta. Ananta means infinite. Infinite simply means absolutely free, right? For example, let's take a practical example. If there is, let's say, a negative emotion in the mind, right? We feel that this negative emotion is limiting me. I feel that I am unhappy, right? So the experience of limitation is that which generates the suffering. We feel conditioned by the experience. Mm-hmm. Now, happiness really means freedom from suffering, which is freedom from limitation. Now, sattva is much more expansiveness because of purity. Still, the fundamental duality is there in sattva, and there is still identification with the mind. So ultimately, you see, now, of course, we must first of all move towards sattva. That's the first thing we must do. To transcend the gunas altogether is the very, very end of the journey. What we must do is to purify our mind through leading a dharmic life, etc., and doing sadhana. Ultimately, as long as the mind operates, as long as we identify with the mind, limitation will be there, because we do not know the self in its true nature, which is absolutely free. So, and it's a very gradual process. You see, at the moment, we have a certain level of happiness and a certain level of bondage. And we aspire to be a little bit more happy. But we always aspire to be a little bit more happy. That's the point. Until we know who we are, which is infinite happiness, we always want to break a little bit more free. That's the idea. So as long as the journey is not completed, as long as we don't know who we are, we always want to remove more limitations, more expansiveness. And therefore, ultimately, we must transcend the guna. It will be a natural desire in us to attain liberation. Okay? The more the mind becomes pure, the more the desire to attain knowledge of the self will become prominent.
So thank you very much, Swamiji. Like, sattva is no doubt a desirable place, but that is not the final destination.
Exactly.
Thank you very much. So I have a couple of requests to you. One, how can people, our friends, participants who have joined us, can follow your work and stay connected with you, or to know about the courses that you offer? Because I know you offer a lot of courses, both online and also through retreats. So how can people follow your work? And secondly, we would like to hear, of course, you have shared it with us generously, but also one parting message before we conclude. But I'll come back to you after making the announcements for tomorrow, and then I'll come back to you for these two things.
Yes.
Ram Prasad ji, can you please show us the poster for tomorrow? So continuing our journey, tomorrow will be our 37th day of the Maha Yajna that we have undertaken from 21st June onwards. We'll have a session from Zoltan Caesar, who will be leading us through a practice session, both theory and practice, of from movement of body and breath to the non-movement of the mind, especially drawing from the Buddhist traditions and also connecting with the approach of Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. He will lead us through a practice where we involve the movement of body and the breath, but which finally will lead to or arrive at the non-movement of the mind. And the session is 7 to 8:30 Indian time. But I would like to add our speaker, our presenter for tomorrow will be joining us from Budapest, Hungary, where he is the director of Dharma Gate Buddhist Church. For him, it will be around 3:30 a.m. in the morning. But he was so kind enough, generous enough to say, no doubt it's going to be a little tough, but I will do it and I want to do it. So that was his generosity. And coming to the evening, it's little odd for me to make the announcement, but I'll just be donning the announcer's role. So I'll be leading a session on Upanishads, the fountainhead of yogic wisdom. This is between 7 to 8:30 p.m., where we will explore how our understanding of yoga today is influenced by the Upanishadic insights. Upanishads seem to have influenced all the Indian and the Eastern thought, how it touches all these strands of thought, and especially the yoga. In the yoga tradition, we draw a lot from the Upanishadic wisdom. So we'll be looking to some of those highlights tomorrow in the evening session. And I also would like to add that all these sessions, such wonderful sessions with Swamiji, like Swami Brahmananda, and all these sessions are recorded and are made available on Indica Yoga YouTube channel, and they will also be available on Indica Yoga website. So kindly make use of the resources available to you and kindly share with the people who would be interested. With this request, I now come back to Swamiji to asking him to tell us how we can follow your work, and also a message that you would like to leave us with for the day.
Thank you. So our website is shivanandabahamas.org, and because of the current circumstances in the world, we are focusing on online programs. So you can see there is online programs, and you will see many beautiful courses that we are offering, all online. And you can see different retreats, different courses in Vedanta, in Yoga Sutras, Bhakti Sutra, Bhagavad Gita, so many beautiful events are there, and people are very welcome to sign up. And the final message is really looking at the lives of Swami Sivananda and Swami Devananda and other great masters, and seeing where did their life come from. It came from their faith, how they saw the world. And millions of people in the world benefit from such a vision. So what we gain from the lives of the saints is their vision. Through studying their lives and joining their missions or serving their missions, we get the benefit of the vision or the faith of how they experience the world. So something of their realization comes to us. And yes, please see also we broadcast daily our satsangs. We have twice a day satsangs in the ashram, 6 a.m. and 8 p.m. Eastern time. It's broadcast free on Facebook, on our Facebook page. You can see it from the website. So here we will conclude. Thank you so much for allowing me to share and to connect to your organization. Again, also I would like to thank Swami Prakasananda that made the connection. And we will conclude with a few mantras.
Thank you, Swamiji, and gratitude to Swamini Atma Prakashananji, as you said, and also to all our participants who have joined us from across the world.
Yeah. Om 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 Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnam Udachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Om peace, peace, peace. O noble Lord of mercy and love, let us abide in thee forever and ever. Om Bolo Satguru Sivananda Maharaj Ki Jai. Swami Vishnu Devananda Maharaj Ki Jai. Om Namah Shivaya. Hari Om Tat Sat.